to you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Gonzalo, to give me the opportunity to participate in this very stimulating cycle, and of course to give me the enormous honor and pleasure to be here with Professor Maria Luisa Portocarrero and also with João Diogo. It's also a big pleasure to be with you. So I asked to João Diogo to project my paper because my speaking my English is not so good in pronunciation, so it will be easier to everyone to follow through the text. So sorry, having some technical issues. Of course, I think this paper is the good way to see how hermeneutical philosophy, hermeneutical rationality can challenge in a certain way analytic philosophy, and it is quite impossible to deal with virtue ethics actually in the present days without at the same time challenging or to cross over with analytic philosophy and of course with all the continental tradition. So it's in that spirit that I presented this talk. And before I dive into the core of my presentation, I'd like to start with some preliminary remarks. Two premises and one historical note. Drawing upon Plato on one side and George Moore on the other, I'll first assume that all moral philosophy is essentially an agatology, where all ethical categories and concepts are deduced or can be extracted from the notion of good. It's enough to say that virtue embodies the general disposition toward good, and that duty entails the obligation of enacting what is internally acknowledged as good, and that utility concerns the good of the greatest number, of course, aimed as a foreseeable outcome or consequence. The first premise is accompanied by a second. In the realm of agatology, understood as a praxeological system, we must acknowledge the distinct and irreducible roles of these three principles: the deontical or deontological principle, the consequentialist principle, and of course the arethaic or arethological principle. We cannot sideline duty, which compensates for spontaneous volitional weaknesses, nor can we ignore the necessity of weighing the outcomes beyond the principles mobilizing the intentions or mobilized by intentions. Likewise, the significance of virtuous character traits shaping the will from within cannot be overlooked. It's crucial to acknowledge how Paul Ricoeur's so-called petite éthique, which is in fact a great ethic, has already put us on this path when it states that the aim for a good life and the reference to...
José, can I just stop you for a little bit, because João is a little bit lost in your text trying to find exactly where you are.
Because these remarks are not in the text.
Yeah, you're doing like an introduction, right? And so
yes,
we can
exactly.
just...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. We can just wait where we are, João, and José will enter into his text. Okay.
I put a summary of the text.
Yeah.
The points, but these remarks are not in the text.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry.
Sure, no worries. So, João, just put on the first lines of the introduction of the text a little below, and José will eventually get there. Okay, yes. Go ahead, please. Sorry, José. Sorry for the mishap.
So I was saying that it was important to acknowledge how Paul Ricoeur in this so-called petite éthique, I think all of us think that it's a great ethique and not a petite éthique, like he says, put us on this path when it states that aim for a good life and the reference to norms and their mutual correction was indispensable in shaping a morality in which solicitude, what he calls solicitude, which is, of course, care, holds a pivotal role. The challenge lies in transcending the simplistic tendency to isolate or to merge or to make a fusion of these three fundamental principles or ethical methods, like used to say, call them Andre Sidgwick. The historical note is not just a curiosity, and that's the first quote I have in the paper that João Diogo is projecting. The historical note is not just a curiosity. In Plato's dialogue Cratylus, which delves in the correctness of names through fanciful etymologies that continue to perplex linguists, the term arete, excellence or virtue, is not linked to the root ar, signifying masculinity or virility. This root, implying strength, courage, and commandment, branches into the terms like Ares, the god of war, Aristos, denoting the brave, or Arsen, meaning male or virile. Instead, Plato associates arete with the notion of a perpetual and free movement of the soul. That's the quote I put there from Plato's Cratylus. Firstly, the word arete denotes ease of movement, euphoria. Then it signifies that the flow that is liberated is always that of the good soul, so that what always flows incessantly and without impediment as it seems receive this appellation. It is correct to call it ae reite, always fluid. Such should be the preferable disposition among all. We will see further in the text how this quote is very important for us. Our general goal is to clarify the theoretical conditions that allows conceive and define care as a virtue within the context of the relationships between the ethics of care and the virtue ethics. We argue that care should find a true ally in the renewed contemporary virtue ethics. Care as both a disposition, care for, and a practice, take care of, as a triple cognitive, affective, and volitional dimensions that leads to morally relevant actions. This functional structure is also present in the most common definitions of virtues. We can consider care as a relational virtue that challenges the formation of the moral agent as a relational self. By being intrinsically empathetic and altruistic, care prioritizes the well-being of others. But conceiving and enacting care as a virtue implies a reconfiguration of traditional understanding of virtue theory. So it does not mean subordinating care to traditional moral conceptions. Rather, it reshapes the old system of virtues and allows for the emergence of a new approach to the notions of moral excellence, moral perfectionism, eudaimonia, or moral agency. By force of the principle of the organic unity and reciprocity of all virtues within virtue, to understand care as a virtue also provides an internal and more fundamental articulation for justice and care, below and beyond their usual antinomy. Moreover, including care in the board of virtues provides, in fact, a pivotal strategic point to overcome the artificial duality between the so-called self-regarding and other-regarding virtues. For caring for ourselves is a necessary condition for caring for others and vice versa. The first preliminary question should be to address the following. Is care a virtue? Care can be said as solicitude, soin, allos epimeleia, sorge, of course. Whatever you choose to call it, is care a virtue? Although the issue is not to discuss the ongoing inquiry, about the relations between the virtue ethics and the ethics of care, we will compare and contrast some aspects of these two approaches to normative and applied ethics. Doing so, one must acknowledge the specificity of these two views on moral practice and theory and avoid a simplistic reductionism or expeditious foundationalism, and also escape a misplaced eclecticism, erasing conflicts and looking for simplistic alliances. If by care we mean the disposition for caring for and caring about, coupled with the ability to take care of, we are certainly before an emotional and sensitive disposition and, simultaneously, the willingness and the practical reasoning enabling one to carry out concrete caregiving actions. If caring for the dear ones, the dear and the near ones, as a basic concern and practice, the so-called natural caring, is required for survival and thrive, an ethical conception of care, which namely extends its scopes and range to strangers and distant to others, is morally virtuous, not only good, not only right, but in fact excellent and admirable, so virtuous. The former being correct, we can argue that care may be fairly seen as a virtue, both intuitively and conceptually. However, this virtue is prima facie aiming at the well-being and flourishing of others, explicitly the vulnerable and dependent ones. Therefore, care is what we may say a relational virtue. Of course, a classical understanding of virtue ethics tends to be, at least, reluctant to embrace this concept of relational ontology, which construes the entire self as constitute, known, and maintained through relationships, as proposed by Moritz Sanderstaud. Nonetheless, conceiving care as a virtue among other virtues, is most challenging for both virtue theory and virtue ethics, stricto sensu. In fact, a virtue of care as intrinsically empathetic, dialogical, other regarding, engages the moral agent on a more fundamental or radical openness to otherness. So the first point will be to see how the ethics of care and virtue ethics cross each other. Which are or might be the relations between the evolving project of an ethics of care or care ethics and as a comprehensive moral theory grounded on the basic notion of caring and as a practice and a value, and a contemporary renewal of virtue ethics. The first perspective is to assert, like Virginia Hells does, that ethics of care has become a moral normative theory on its own right, fully consistent. In this way, it embodies an original and reliable alternative, theoretically consistent and pragmatically fruitful, not only to Kantian deontology and to utilitarian consequentialism, but also to virtue ethics itself, which re-emerge as a third way to the former two. The virtue ethics and the ethics of care, in fact, begin sharing the same opponents. The respect for duty and strict obedience to rules or universal laws, the impartial calculation of utility, or the former adequacy of mutually disinterested individuals to contractual justice do not provide answers to the personal or interpersonal motivations or flourishing issues, and do not pay attention to the close relationships. Neither have they enhanced the practical reasoning or emotional response implied by concrete situations and dilemmas. Nevertheless, Carol Gilligan's or Sandrine Berger's seek to emancipate their own theory from the pre-modern historical burden that virtue ethics carries. Virtue ethics is accused of being, in the first point, androcentric and elitist in this classical profile, excluding women, slaves, and strangers from the city. It is accused to be self-centered or formally egoistic. It is accused to be based on strength and courage, which is the first virtue. The etymological roots of ar and wir both meaning rewrite strength. And at last, it is accused to emphasize the ideas of potency, power, effectiveness, and excellence of achievement because of the metaphysical grounding of the notion of virtue. It is about fulfilling a given nature or essence, an ontological way of being, the famous and strange ergon that Aristotle speaks about in the Nicomachean Ethics. Given the power for self-assertion, self-promotion, and self-realization that embodies the metaphysical sense of the idea of virtue, it becomes apparent that our self-love, self-esteem, self-care assumes primacy in a strictly ethical and moral sense, like we see in magnanimity and megalopsyche as some expression of Greek ethics. So, virtue ethics is about the acquisition, possession, and expression of such individual moral skills or capacities. Instead, the ethics of care claims to be rooted not in the individuals, but in the relations and the relational practices. So, virtue ethics focusing on the agent's character and dispositions seems to some care ethicists to simply miss the central point. That is, the close relations, asymmetrical and dependent, and the practices that supported them. Carol Gilligan's different voice gives rise to a theory that focuses on women's moral experience and care relationships, in which the constitutive vulnerability and the human conditions is highlighted and understood as crucial. Therefore, such a theory is often presented as, I quote, an ethical theory by and for women, and a feminist ethics, seeking to emancipate itself from the pre-modern historical burden that virtue ethics carries, I just said. Fabienne Brugère, contends that the ethics of care begins with a theoretical invention, the relational or independent and vulnerable subject, taken in asymmetrically defined caring relationships. On the one hand, that relationships engages the responsibility of the caretaker. On the other hand, it attests the vulnerability of the one being cared for. We are dealing with relational selves, and the Kantian notion, and of course, the Kantian notion of autonomy seems no longer to be a major aspect of moral agency. In this way, care is not a virtue, but what mobilizes or promotes the aptitudes, skills, and virtues between moral agent and the moral patient, the one caring and the one cared. The second perspective argues that care ethics should be included and subsumed under virtue ethics, an archetypic or archaeological moral theory that goes beyond the neo-Aristotelian framework will be able to respond to the theoretical and practical challenges of care. Many scholars, even feminist ethicists, support an integration of care ethics into virtue ethics by assimilation or derivation. Margaret McLaren, Lisa Tessman, Raja Alwani, Alan Thomas are researchers who argue in favor of these hypotheses. This notion assumes that, regardless of its extreme importance as a value, as a practice, care does not offer, as an ethical concept, sufficient support for a comprehensively constructed moral theory. Care does not allow grounding or conceiving the whole field of morality. In fact, not all moral life can be thought from partiality, asymmetry, and the model of the close relations. These authors begin by emphasizing the similarities or compatibilities between care ethics and virtue ethics. Let's see what these common or corresponding features are. Both want to put forward what has been missed or disregarded by Kantian deontology, utilitarian consequentialism, or Rawlsian contractualism. They share a particularistic tendency, responsive to the concrete situations carried out by unique individuals implicated in specific contexts and differentiated practices, which cannot be subsumed to abstract principles and universal norms. They both acknowledge the importance of emotions and feeling, affective responsiveness, emotional engagement or response, such as empathy, compassion, or benevolence, are essential. In addition, virtue ethics and care ethics, unlike dominant moral theories, pay equally attention to the question of acquisition, development, and perfecting of moral conscience. It is almost needless to recall the context in which the ethical issue of care is born, the critique of Kohlberg's theory of moral development and its deontological and cognitive assumptions. Quoting, and we can see also this question present in virtue theory, quoting Julianus, understanding the process of ethical education is a part of virtue ethics. So, care can become part of the cast, of the board, of the list of virtues, along with justice, temperance, courage, honesty, generosity, and so forth. This theoretical proposal presents internal variants regarding the definition, weight, and scope given to the virtues of care, but that's another issue. The third perspective to be considered is more than an integration, is some kind of a fusion between the ethics of care and the ethics of virtue. Such is Mike Slaughter's proposal, an important virtue theorist exploring a sentimentalist virtue ethics centered on the motivational and affective dimensions of virtue. He ends up bringing together the British tradition of moral sentimentalism, an ethics of archetype contours, and the problematic of care. In fact, in recent years, Michael Slaughter has developed a form of care ethics that seeks to be virtue ethical as well as to be so entirely within a sentimentalist framework. Moral sentimentalism states that, of course, moral judgment and motivation derive more from feeling and emotion than from reason. So the point is to make the notion of benevolence converge as a universal collocation, directly inspired by Hutcheson, with care having a particularistic vocation, mobilizing empathy and emphasizing its ethical function in the context of care relationships. The goal is to build a virtue ethical care ethics focused on individual qualities and motivations. In this one so-called one agent-based virtue ethics, care is somehow the primary virtue or the main virtue from which other virtues may derive. We will rather say that it's what is virtuous in all virtues, or the emotional and motivational matrix of all virtues. Morality based on the virtue of care may offer a general criterion of a right or good action, which can be formulated in strictly archetype terms. Let us quote Slaughter. Care ethics treats acts as right or wrong, depending on whether they exhibit a caring or uncaring attitude, motivation on the part of the agent. Or, in other words, an act is morally acceptable if and only if it comes from good or virtuous motivation involving benevolence or caring about the well-being of others, or at least doesn't come from bad or inferior motivation involving malice or indifference to humanity. So we have, in the first point, the exclusion from the care point of view of the traditional idea of virtue. In a second point, a second possibility, which is the inclusion of a care point of view in virtue ethics. A third position, which is the fusion with sentimentalist virtue ethics. We can add a fourth position, which is our own position, somehow a metamorphosis, a metanoia, a reconfiguration of virtue theory by the inclusion of the virtue of care. My point of view and proposition involves the reshaping of the whole virtue theory and virtue ethics stricto sensu to align with the evolving demands of care issues. In this proposition, care retains its fundamental essence, with its cognitive, affective, volitional, and practical specificities, while all other virtues undergo a mutational improvement. Instead of promoting the merge of the fusion, our proposition emphasizes a process of mutual enhancement between care and virtues, and the reconfiguration or transfiguration of their arithologic system. But first, we shall underline very briefly why what I understand to be the common inner framework of care and virtues that allows conceiving and care as a virtue among virtues. What enables us to conceptualize the disposition, the ability, the practice, and the value of care, again, as care for, care about, take care of, or caregiving as a virtue. What is the functional characterization of care? UN Toronto identifies four main elements of care: attentiveness, responsibility, competence, and responsiveness. Being compliant with these functional elements, we argue that they can be grounded on a common and more fundamental functional structure that ensures the principle of integrity much praised by Toronto. We believe that an emotional, cognitive, and volitional dispositional framework that enables, propels, and supports morality and ethically relevant practices is more basically required and involved. So, being very, and maybe just point out two of the elements because to be to not to take too long, but maybe the first two. Care implies a cognitive dimension, knowing and understanding the concrete situations experienced by singular persons. For this reason, Sarah Rudick, for example, insists on the idea of a practicalist, what she calls a practicalist reasoning. And Nathalie Maillard, a French representative of philosophy of care, uses the fine expression of an epistemology of the particular. We are therefore very close to the fundamental element of the Aristotelian virtue ethics, of course, the notion of phronesis. Phronesis is understood as a practical reasoning or a deliberative wisdom, determining how to act properly by assessing situations and adjusting means to ends. Of course, the second point, care has an important affective dimension. This aspect has been underlined as fundamental and characteristic. The notion of emotional engagement, on sentimental responsiveness, etc. Notice underlines that the need to analyze and distinguish the several aspects of affective life, because of course affective life is very hierarchically and functionally very distinct. We have the affect, emotion, feeling, sentiments, all are different things. And in that context, he always gets near, of course, the problematic of the moral sentimentalism of the Scottish Enlightenment. So, jumping to the fourth element, Toronto is very explicit, saying that care is both a practice and a disposition. So the whole practice and range of care runs out that theoretical disposition framework somewhat stabilized as an acquired character trait, built in practice, just like a virtue. Saying that care is a disposition is, of course, say that is an exis, an habitus in the traditional sense, so a virtue, of course. And a virtue is a persisting, reliable, and characteristic disposition, exis habitus of the person, which expresses itself in acting, reasoning, and feeling in certain ways. We find the same three-dimensional framework. A virtue is a complex character trait with intellectual, affective, and cognitive features that produces right actions and expresses commitment to goodness. And of course, virtues are conceived as dispositions acquired by a repeated practice. It is doing virtuous action that one shapes motivations, abilities, and character as virtuous. Of course, we can become virtuous exercising the virtue. So it is important to connect these elements of the character trait with, of course, the effective practice of virtues. So what are the advantages or the benefits of understanding the care theory and caring practices from an archetype point of view? In the first reason for that is that it preserves the most characteristic elements of the issue of care, the importance of asymmetric relationships and caring practices within a conception of the human and vulnerable being. It allows framing care in a broader and more structured conception of normative and ethics, fostered by the renewal and extension of both the notion of virtue and the list of virtues. In fact, once one takes into account the dialectic of autonomy and vulnerability and faces the duality of dependency and self-sufficiency in moral agency within virtue theory, the board of virtue must be extended. That is the point. It provides an internal and suitable articulation for justice and care, escaping the paralyzing dichotomy. This is because justice, before being taken as the result of the quality of formal institutions, a contractual and procedural system of norms and rules, subject to the equitable logos of distribution, compensations, and proportionality, is, as Aristotle emphasizes, a personal virtue. Consequently, it is already at the level of the ethical dispositions, motivations, and intentions that justice and care are articulated, for they are mutually governed by the principle of organic unity and reciprocity of virtues. Such principle is essential on virtue theory since Aristotle and the Stoics. We should consistently add and emphasize, as Vladimir Yankelevich does, that unlike duties and norms, instincts and pleasures, virtues do not compete with each other, but rather require each other reciprocally and can even transform into one another. In fact, the dilemma between care and justice is another way to express the traditional dilemma between charity and justice, the effective principle of love and the rational principle of justice competing for sustaining morality. I argue that the first way for the demands of care to pervade at social, political, and global levels is to include care together with justice in a moral board of virtues, shaping moral conscience and agency. In a virtue ethical approach, care and justice as virtues are compatible by mutually enriching and correcting themselves. In order to be consistent with the conception of a normative moral theory, an account of right action must be provided. Virtue ethics deliver such requisite, so care ethics will benefit from it. The archetype criterion of morality is not about just acting in accordance with duties instituted in procedural, legal, or contractual terms, nor is it to choose the action that has the best consequences, producing the greatest overall amount of happiness. From a strict archetype point of view, right action is one resulting from the exercise of a virtue in concrete circumstances, or the one that a virtuous agent would characteristically perform in the same circumstances. Right actions are the expression of virtuous dispositions and virtuous agents. Acting virtuously in a good enough or excellent way is to do the right thing for the right reason and the appropriate way, as Aristotle established it. But after all, what is a virtue? We'll consider and assume the contemporary definition proposed by Lita Zagajewski, saying that a virtue is a deep and enduring acquired excellence of a person, involving a characteristic motivation to produce a certain desired end and reliable success in bringing about that end. This definition, which can be completed with the one offered by Rosalind Earsthouse, quoting, "A virtue is a character trait a human being needs for eudaimonia to flourish and to live well." So, and what are the advantages, and the transformations for virtue theory and virtue ethics resulting from including care in the board of virtues? It is not just a matter of understanding how the practice or the theory of care benefit from intertwining with virtue theory, but also of recognizing the benefits that virtue ethics gains from the introduction of the virtue of care. In the same way as Christianity challenges the Greek ethos, calling for humility, compassion, or charity as moral excellences, or that David Hume proposes benevolence, honesty, or industriousness for the least of moral qualities, the demands of the post-modern globalized world not only make care eligible for the board of virtues, but in fact represents a sort of revolution in virtue theory. In a certain sense, it is a breakthrough or a paradigm shift as important as the introduction with St. Augustine of the virtue of caritas. Once caritas is introduced into the system of virtues, it is all the other excellences that undergo transformation. The cardinal virtues of courage, temperance, and justice do not mean the same thing for an ancient Greek citizen as they do for a Christian man, because they stand before charity in a sense of gracious love and forgiveness. The virtue of care is primarily relational and other regarding. Such specificity challenges the moral agent to a more radical, a more deep and wide openness to otherness. Within virtuous practice of care, the interests of the one caring and the one cared, the care receiver, become intertwined, thus defying the theoretical and practical constitution of a relational self. In this sense, care is a relational virtue, in which the excellence of the relation takes precedence of the excellence of the individual agents involved. Not only can we conceive and enact care as a virtue, but we can also view traditional virtues as multiple expressions of care. The integration of the plurality of virtues into a unified ethical aim through a virtue, understood as a general disposition towards the good, is renewed by this mutual implication and reversibility of care and the traditional virtues. We must sort out the dilemma and the conflict between self-care and care for others, or in other words, the dichotomy between the so-called self-regarding and other-regarding virtues. Michael Sloat refers to this duality as the position of agent favoring self-other asymmetry, and the agent sacrificing self-other asymmetry. To overcome the difficulties posed by characterological and casuistic distinctions, we must first avoid the reductionist choice between an egoistic and a sacrificial perspective. It is crucial to go beyond the opposition that reinforces a profound asymmetry between the self and the other in moral action and ethical life. To achieve these, we must accept the following assumptions. First, the principle of organic unity, mutual implication, and reciprocity of virtues, which means reconducting the plurality of virtues to the unity of ethical aims into virtue. The intrinsically relational dimension of moral action, which integrates both other and self-referential motivations and values. The intersubjective configuration or of moral subjectivity and agency as a relational self. The recognition of care as a virtue among virtues, which promotes a reconfiguration of the old aretologic doctrine. And last, the re-evaluation of the idea of perfection and the notion of moral perfectionism based on the previous assumptions and within a dialogical rather than an egological dynamics. On this dialogical principle and mutual implication can prevent the endless, this mutual implication, can prevent the endless casuistic analysis in which considerations between self-regarding virtues or other regarding virtues and mixed virtues linger and get bogged down. Including care in the board of virtues is in fact a pivotal strategic point. It helps to overcome the artificial duality between self versus other, referentiality. For caring for oneself is a necessary condition for caring for others. Actually, it is important to note that care theorists reject a self-sacrificial conception of care, like Gilligan, just as virtue ethicists reject moral egoism, like Anas. Since we are defined in relation, for one hand, caring is thus both self-serving and other-serving, says Nodings in 1993. An ethics of virtue is therefore at most formally self-centered or egoistic, for, quoting Anas, its content can be fully as other regarding as that the other system of ethics. In fact, and most generally, self-regarding dispositions and skills enable other regarding abilities. There is no justice or sincerity without courage and prudence. That's just as there is no generosity without temperance, nor benevolence without magnanimity and humility. It is also clear that promoting the good of others requires not only other regarding virtues and motivations, but also electing and encouraging the acquisition and development of self-regarding virtues in others. Since virtues are admirable character traits and abilities developed through practice, promoting them involves a convergence of self-care and care for others in a system of virtues that is an open totality, with each part expressing the whole. The foregoing discussion prompts a re-evaluation of the concept of moral perfectionism, which must not be conflated with self-centeredness or moral egotism. Instead, the pursuit of moral excellence should be understood in relation to the overreaching ideal of goodness. In this context, Iris Murdoch's philosophy offers a valuable perspective by emphasizing the importance of moral development in relation to the ideal of perfection and by challenging us to transcend mere egological self-assertion, recognizing the interdependence between moral endeavor and the common good. Although not being a virtue ethicist, stricto sensu, Iris Murdoch defends the thesis of the unity and convergence of virtues. So often Iris Murdoch takes up the idea already so dear to the Stoics that virtues are not possessed separately, assuming the Augustinian belief that all virtues are expressions of the love and goodwill, adopting the Aristotelian principle that all are guided by a form of practical wisdom, or that the unity of virtues is governed by the good beyond any egocentric confinement or of the moral conscience. So, I'm sorry to be so long, but a very quick conclusion. So the ethics of care emphasizes the vulnerable condition of the human being, highlighting the dependence and fragility of the moral patient amidst the challenges and tensions of the contemporary world, whether it is a postmodern or an hyper-modern world, of course. However, in this same context, it is crucial to acknowledge that the moral agent is both capable and fallible, as Ricoeur reminds us. So it is necessary to understand that caring for oneself and caring for others are intertwined and mutually dependent. Thus, the ethics of autonomy and the ethics of vulnerability are reunited in a virtue theory transformed through the incorporation of care as a virtue and implicated and in a reconfiguration of the notion of goodness and moral perfectionism. The development of ethical moral dispositions, aptitudes, and skills that we can designate as virtues implies the convergence of caring for oneself and caring for others. Without the development of the self-regarding virtues of courage, temperance, practical wisdom, and humility, the moral agent will not be effectively able to exercise the other regarding virtues of justice, generosity, and sincerity. Thank you very much for your attention.